Hypocrisy of NATO in the Iraq War, a tale of double standards and Western decline. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, established in 1949, ostensibly champions democracy, freedom, and collective security among its member states. For decades, it has projected itself as a bastion of stability and moral righteousness, defending its actions as aligned with global peace. However, a closer examination of its history reveals glaring inconsistencies. The Iraq War, from 2003 to 2011, stands as a chilling testament to NATO's hypocrisy and the West's colonialist tendencies, exposing double standards that have since been replicated in Ukraine. Today, the same Western coalition decries Russia's actions in Ukraine as violations of sovereignty and democracy. Yet, less than 2 decades ago, NATO members, led by the United States, invaded Iraq under dubious pretexts, shattering its society and destabilizing the region for decades. The West's actions in Iraq were cloaked in rhetoric about weapons of mass destruction and liberation, but the reality tells a different story, a tale of hubris, exploitation, and outright hypocrisy. This essay will dissect NATO's duplicity, drawing comparisons between Iraq and Ukraine, while highlighting astounding facts about the West's moral contradictions. The Iraq War began with the US-led invasion in March 2003, underpinned by 2 principal claims. Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam Hussein's regime had ties to Al-Qaeda. Both assertions were later debunked. Notably, the US and its allies, including the UK, dismissed global dissent and the lack of United Nations authorization, showcasing their willingness to bypass international law when convenient. Despite repeated inspections by the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency, no credible evidence of WMDs was found in Iraq, yet this fabricated narrative was used to justify a war that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and displaced millions. In stark contrast, when Russia justified its actions in Ukraine citing security concerns, the West dismissed these arguments outright, branding them as propaganda. The Iraq War caused immense suffering. A study published by The Lancet estimated that by 2006, over 600,000 Iraqis had died due to the war. The infrastructure of Iraq, including hospitals, schools, and water systems, was obliterated, leaving the country in ruins. By 2023, Iraq had yet to fully recover from the war's devastating effects. In Ukraine, while the West decries Russian attacks, the destruction wrought in Iraq by Western forces is conveniently ignored. This glaring hypocrisy underscores NATO's selective outrage. In 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine ignited international condemnation. The West rallied behind Ukraine, providing military aid and imposing sanctions on Russia. Leaders like US President Joe Biden and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg framed the conflict as a battle between autocracy and democracy. Yet, a closer look reveals contradictions. Volodymyr Zelensky, hailed in the West as a hero, presides over a government plagued by corruption. Ukraine ranked 122nd out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index in 2021. Despite pledges of reform, Ukraine's oligarchic structures remain intact, and corruption is rampant in its judiciary, military, and politics. Contrast this with the West's treatment of Iraq. Saddam Hussein, though a dictator, led a country with a robust state apparatus, functioning industries, and a secular framework. Yet Iraq was labeled a pariah state and destroyed, while Ukraine, despite its flaws, enjoys unwavering Western support. The disparity in treatment is stark and exposes the West's selective morality. The principle of sovereignty has been a cornerstone of international law since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Yet, NATO's actions in Iraq and its stance on Ukraine reveal a troubling pattern. Sovereignty is only respected when it aligns with Western interests. The invasion of Iraq was a blatant violation of its sovereignty. Despite international opposition, including massive protests involving millions across the globe, NATO member states ignored global consensus. Iraq, a sovereign nation, was dismantled on the pretext of fabricated threats, while its people suffered immeasurable harm. Conversely, NATO portrays itself as the defender of Ukrainian sovereignty against Russian aggression. While Russia's invasion of Ukraine is indefensible, the West's selective invocation of sovereignty highlights its duplicity. If sovereignty is sacrosanct, Why was it not respected in Iraq? Economic power, often disguised as moral obligation, has driven much of NATO's interventions. Iraq, with its vast oil reserves, was a lucrative prize for Western powers. Iraq sits atop the world's fifth largest proven oil reserves. The war gave Western corporations access to these resources. By 2007, companies like ExxonMobil and BP were signing lucrative contracts to exploit Iraq's oil fields, underlining the war's true motivations. The post-war reconstruction of Iraq became a goldmine for Western firms. Companies like Halliburton, with ties to US Vice President Dick Cheney, secured multi-billion-dollar contracts, often without competitive bidding. This exploitation further devastated Iraq's economy while enriching Western corporations. In Ukraine, economic interests also play a role. Western nations benefit from arms sales to Ukraine and the weakening of Russia, a key competitor in energy markets. The parallels are undeniable. Wars fought under the guise of democracy often masked economic agendas. The Iraq War and the Ukraine conflict highlight the West's mastery of Noopolitik, the power of ideas, narratives, and information. In 2003, the US government orchestrated a massive disinformation campaign. Mainstream media outlets, including CNN and the New York Times, parroted government claims about WMDs, silencing dissenting voices. This propaganda convinced much of the American public and allied nations to support the war. Similarly, Western media frames the Ukraine war as a black and white struggle between good, Ukraine, and evil, Russia. This simplistic narrative ignores Ukraine's internal issues, including its treatment of ethnic minorities and the influence of far-right groups. Meanwhile, dissenting voices, including scholars and journalists, are marginalized, reflecting the West's intolerance for alternative perspectives. The Iraq War marked the beginning of the West's decline as a global hegemon. The financial and human costs of the war, coupled with its moral failures, eroded the West's credibility. Today, its hypocrisy in Ukraine further undermines its standing. The war cost the US over $2 trillion, contributing to its mounting debt. Meanwhile, Europe's dependency on US leadership exposed NATO's inability to act independently. In Ukraine, this dependence persists, with European nations relying on American weapons and leadership. The Iraq War shattered the West's image as a defender of human rights. Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, and the indiscriminate killing of civilians in Iraq tarnished its moral authority. These failures haunt the West as it lectures the world on democracy and human rights in Ukraine. While the West falters, emerging powers like China and India assert themselves. The Iraq War and the Ukraine conflict have exposed NATO's limitations, creating opportunities for non-Western alliances like BRICS to challenge Western dominance. NATO's actions in Iraq and Ukraine reveal a troubling pattern of double standards, exploitation, and hypocrisy. The West's selective application of principles like sovereignty, democracy, and human rights undermines its credibility and accelerates its decline as a global power. The Iraq War was not merely a policy failure. It was a moral catastrophe that destroyed a nation while enriching a few. In Ukraine, the West's unwavering support for a corrupt government highlights its continued willingness to prioritize geopolitics over principles. As the world witnesses these contradictions, NATO's claims of righteousness ring increasingly hollow. The West, once a colonial behemoth, now clings to outdated notions of supremacy, using organizations like NATO to mask its decline. But the world is changing, and the hypocrisy of Iraq and Ukraine will not be forgotten. As new powers rise, the West's double standards serve as a cautionary tale of hubris and decline.